Always appreciate the analysis and insight that both Chris Hedges and Dr. Cornel West provide. So, and to our luck and benefit, Hedges was interviewing Dr. Cornel West on his show On Contact. So let's take a look, listen, and discuss a little bit.
Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the seizure of the U.S. Capitol by a Trump
Attempted
mob
seizure.
Political philosopher, moral philosopher, Dr. Cornel West.
I expect to see a slide down a slippery slope to increased repression, increased social misery, increased not just polarization, but gangsterization. And that's a very sad prospect for the American empire and democratic possibility. Can we turn it around? Well, some of us are committed. Dr. Howard Legacy, Martin Luther King Jr., Fannie Lou Hamer, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Edward Said, Grace Ball, and these folk have an unstoppable fire for love of truth and love of beauty and justice. And so we got to somehow come up with ways in which, following your example and others, we continue to try to be candid about the grimness.
Yep.
And yet still always looking for breakthroughs so that the dignity of everyday people, poor and working people, here and around the world.
Look at all the books in his background. Isn't that awesome?
Our vision.
Want to know where to invest $1,000?
Fuck off. I don't give a shit. Get out of here.
Enraged supporters of Donald Trump stormed the Capitol on Wednesday, halting Congress's counting of the electoral votes to confirm the victory of President-elect Joe Biden. Lawmakers were hastily evacuated from the building. Several people were injured, some seriously. One woman was shot, and 3 others died. While Trump and his allies incited and stoked the violence, the occupation of the Congress is also evidence of a deep
decay,
that is gripping huge sections of the working class. In the end, it is not Trump and the conspiracy theorists who support
Crackers on the wall.
spawned this attempted insurrection, but the rupturing of social bonds, which is always expressed
QAnoner right there.
and aggressive.
At least they're wearing a mask. Good on you.
The widespread despair has fostered what the anthropologist Roger Lancaster calls poisoned solidarity, the communal intoxication forged from the negative energies of fear, racism,
Poison solidarity,
suspicion, envy, and the lust for violence and vengeance. Nations in decline embrace, as Sigmund Freud understood, this death instinct. No longer sustained by the comforting illusion
social
of
bonds have broken down.
progress, they lose the only antidote to nihilism. No longer able to build, they confuse destruction with creation.
Wow.
They descend into political dysfunction, fascism, and atavistic savagery. Something not only Freud but Joseph Conrad and Primo Levi knew lurks beneath the thin veneer of civilized society. Joining me to discuss America's existential crisis is the moral philosopher Dr. Cornel West, professor of the practice of public philosophy at Harvard
Looks like it would
University,
be a great book.
and the author of numerous books, including Race Matters. So, Cornel, you are one of a handful. I was mentioning Sheldon Wolin before we went on the air, maybe Richard Rorty, although perhaps not as powerfully in his last book, Achieving Our Country, who has seen this malaise building, this what Durkheim would call this
anime
building over decades, and the political and moral consequences. And I want you to put what happened
in context.
Wednesday night in historical and perhaps even moral context.
Well, one, I just want to begin by saluting you, though, brother, because your work over the last 30 years, intellectually, politically, has laid bare why these chickens are coming home to roost in the way that they are. We're reaping what we sow.
Yep. Empire.
I happened to be reading a text last night. It's the Gunfighter Nation, the myth of the frontier. This is a classic, 1992. Brother Richard Clark. What is he talking about? Well, he actually gives us a sense of why it is that we can understand the not just authoritarian populism, but the neo-fascism in the country, the moral regeneration through violence, the very notion that we conceive ourselves as the civilized vis-a-vis the savages, vis-a-vis the barbarians that don't realize the savagery is very much in
The
the
DNA of
civilized
the
folk,
U.S.
vis-a-vis indigenous people.
Yes. Enslavement of black
vis-a-vis
folk.
workers, vis-a-vis women, vis-a-vis black folk, all of them viewed as less than human, degraded other, and then the manifest destiny. So he understands America as an empire. It's not a democracy with deficits, but it's a democratic experiment within the backdrop of indigenous people's land dispossessed, their bodies violated, enslavement of Africans, subordination of workers,
LGBT folks,
domination of women, gays, lesbians, trans. And yet at the same time, he knows there's a counter tradition. And that's very important too. There's ways in which we can actually grow up and unflinchingly keep track of the barbarism in our midst in order to have more.
Just something that both Chris Hedges and Dr. Cornel West do an amazing job of.
Democratic possibilities. The best of Emerson, the best of Whitman, the best of Martin Luther King Jr., the best of Muriel Rukeyser, the best of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. So what we have is we have an empire in profound spiritual decay.
Yes.
And wrestling with moral decrepitude, with the rule of big money, the rule of big military, a predatory capitalist society that's commodifying everything. So people having very little sense of who they are or sources of meaning in their lives in the midst of social misery, suffering, decrepit schools, dilapidated housing,
deindustrialization,
unemployment, hardly access to medical care, especially for foreign working people, even given Obamacare, and then the greed of elite, unbelievable greed of elite, massive distribution of wealth from foreign working people to the top 1%. And the public face, white supremacy. It's one of the last things to hold on to. And, you think about this, Brother Chris. I mean, you and I, of course, we spent such good time together. But, when we talked about the neo-fascism, people were laughing at us. People would think, oh, you're going too far. It's a new kind of conservative Republican Party. Of course, he's a narcissist. Of course, he's a liar. No, this is much deeper than Trump.
Yes.
It's
a symptom.
The whole history of the country.
Correct.
And the worst of it, with, as you say, with Freud and Levy and the others, the worst of those deep, barbaric, monstrous forces always just beneath the surface. And of course, being a black man in society, slavery and Jim Crow and Jane Crow and lynching and the new Jim Crow and the mass incarceration, those are quasi-fascist zones in the history of the nation from the very beginning.
Yes.
And the slavery being the foundation.
Yes. And the genocide of Native folks. Yeah.
So that on the one hand, I'm never surprised by any form of evil. Just as a revolutionary Christian, I'm never surprised by any form of evil. So this kind of neo-fascist public display is not new. Of course, I was there in Charlottesville with the neo-Nazis and the Klan. It's not new, but I'm not in any way paralyzed by despair either. Not at all. This is a time to fight. This is time to look for new possibilities, for change.
I want to ask you about Emil Durkheim's book on suicide. It's the Cornel West reading list. We're friends, and I get free lectures and advice. Anyway, you pushed me to read that book.
You pushed me to read those wonderful texts.
Writing that book down.
I love it.
And that's On Suicide by Emil Durkheim.
Durkheim, when he writes about suicide, that's where we get the term anime. Right. He talks about how when social bonds are ruptured, then both societies and individuals begin to carry out acts of self-destruction. Self-annihilation. Yeah. I mean, one of the fascinating points he makes in the book is that those who seek the annihilation of others, these kind of right-wing, militia,
also seek the annihilation of themselves, I'm assuming. Let's see if I'm right.
Are driven by desires for self-annihilation.
Boom.
And those rupturing of social bonds, which is something that you were in many ways a voice in the wilderness crying about even decades ago, I think lies at the core of what we saw on Wednesday night and what's happening. 74 million Americans,
Voted
mostly
for
white,
Trump.
of course, supporting this cult-like figure of Trump, disconnected from reality. But I found so much of the coverage, I don't know what you thought, where they were demonized as thugs, which is not in any way, of course, to condone their activity, missing the point that there was complicity within the ruling elite and within the Democratic Party establishment for what's happened, and the core being the rupturing of these social bonds.
I think you're absolutely right, though, brother. I mean, I think about 17 years ago when I had published Democracy Matters, and I talked about there's hardly a democracy left because of the nihilism, the various forms of nihilism, the notion not just of might makes right and greed is good, but the massive shattering of families, communities, bonds, networks. So you end up with not just isolated.
Yeah, just the total lack of real connection and just the total evisceration of any type of tangible safety net here in the U.S.
Persons, but you also end up with persons unable to provide, unable to generate any kind of story to live by, unable to situate themselves in a national narrative that has any connection with reality. And I think it is a profoundly nihilistic moment, and nihilism is a lived experience of tremendous wound and hurt. I mean, when I was there in Charlottesville, when I looked in the eyes of the neo-Nazis, I saw deep wounds and hurts and joylessness and lovelessness and a search for meaning. They just hated me. They wanted to kill me. But I could still understand the ways in which they were very much a product of a predatory capitalist culture that is just money, 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 and they actually were being subjugated in their own distinctive ways. They just happened to be vicious white supremacists as well, And I think that's in part what we're dealing with. Yes, Trump certainly is a symbol and a sign and a symptom, but neoliberal rule has helped create the conditions for the kind of neo-fascist, authoritarian, populist, whatever language you want to use, in the ways in which the unbelievable contempt that people have across the board for neoliberal elites, for the professional classes, for the chattering classes, for the educated classes. I mean, the tyranny of merit that Brother Michael Sandel talks about in his book, or the cult of smart that Brother Frederick DeBoer talks about in his book. All of those have to do with the arrogance, the self-righteousness, the self-indulgent sense of entitlement that is so indifferent to the plight and predicament of poor and working people, but it's always tied on the right wing with the white supremacist public face. There's no doubt about it. And it is profoundly white supremacist, but it's not just that. And what you usually have, of course, in corporate media is just the recycling of a certain neoliberal identity that is Manichaean. We're on the good side, they're on the bad side. Yes, they are on the moral side. It's deep, but it's so much deeper than that. And I would really just recommend the reader.
What's that? No other explain.
Death in the liberal class and various other powerful texts. The work on Christian fascism that you talked about, that was at work yesterday there as well.
Yeah. Great. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Cornel West about the American malaise.
Sometimes getting...
Fuck off. Hate these ads. But wow, like, I mean, how powerful is that Cornel West, while at that white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, VA back in 2017, while reckoning with the white supremacist nature of those people there, was still able to kind of decipher the despair, the lovelessness, the dismay that they were going through, while still realizing that those same people, you know, think of him as less than human. I mean, the dude is, yeah, impressive to say the least, for sure.
We continue our conversation with the moral philosopher Dr. Cornel West about the American malaise, or what Emil Durkheim would call anomie. I want to talk about the liberal class. Again, you just recommended this great biography of Dostoevsky, which I just finished. And Dostoevsky understood the danger of a bankrupt liberalism. Notes from the Underground is really about that. There you go. Stunning, absolutely stunning,
Right.
great intellectual biography. I want to
I'm
talk
going to
about
write
the
that down
class.
too here.
Again, you just recommended this great biography of Dostoevsky, which I just finished.
I'll pause it
And
so I can
Dostoevsky
get this name.
understood the danger of a bankrupt liberalism. Notes from the Underground is really about that.
Dostoevsky, his life and work. I think I'll just take a picture. Might be a little easier. Boom. And continue.
There you go. Stunning, absolutely stunning, great intellectual biography. Yeah, they don't write them like that anymore.
Bukowski.
But I want to talk. But Dostoevsky's right that Dostoevsky saw bankrupt liberalism. I think again this is a theme that you have hit repeatedly as an engine towards the rupturing of these bonds and the rise of these nihilistic, violent movements. Can you speak about that?
Well, when you think about the greatest novelistic tradition in the modern world, which is the Russian tradition, Turgenev understood it, Dostoevsky understood it, Tolstoy understood it, Chekhov understood it. They were understanding the ways in which people must have a sense of connecting their self-respect with a community, with a tradition, with a heritage, in the face of markets, in the face of bureaucracies, in the face of nation states. There had to be some kind of enabling cultural matrix, some structures of meaning and feeling that allows to get people make their move from wombs to tombs. Now, of course, they were doing this in the context of a Russian empire that was already smothering a Russian nation. The folk themselves were massively oppressed and dominated. And early on, they were tied to, of course, French, where the well-to-do spoke French. But sooner or later, the discovery of the folk, and then on to the revolution. And then, of course, we can tell stories about domination of Lenin and all the way up to Putin. But the crucial thing is that Dostoevsky becomes indispensable in understanding the civil war taking place on the souls of people, given commodification and given the collapse of the national narrative. I mean, it's very interesting. I mean, Biden gets up and talks about a narrative that was true for the 1950s. We are the city on the deal. We yes, you just supported the military coup in Honduras.
Yeah.
And you think the Honduras people are going to view you as some kind of democratic example? We know the histories in Iran. We know Guatemala, Brazil,
Syria.
We go on and on and on. What, 267 interventions in 67 cities since 1945? That's American foreign policy. But then on the other hand, you get Mitch Romney. They have self-government without a commitment to truth. When was the last time, not Mitch Romney, Mitch McConnell, we can't have self-government until we have a commitment to truth. Politics can't be just a matter of power. He's the example of the most raw commitment to power that we have. Here comes Schumer. The most important thing is democracy. Since when has the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, neoliberal policy, not been tied to big money,
Never.
Wall Street, and Pentagon militarism? So the nihilism is overwhelming because people are saying, my God, this hypocrisy is out of control. Mm-hmm. This greed is out of control. What are the countervailing forces that allow us to fight against it? Fewer and fewer.
Yes.
And that's part of our challenge. Here around the world, fewer and pure, how do you hold on to honesty, decency, kindness, commitments to justice, honesty, and being unflinchingly candid about the grimness and yet still being willing to muster the courage to hold on to a love of truth and goodness and beauty, and a Christian like myself, the holy of God.
I want to ask about Biden. He reminds me of von Papen, takes power in 1932.
In Germany?
A sense
Weimar?
von Papen wants to bring back the ancien regime, this kind of utopian conservatism. This seems very much what Biden is attempting to do in the Democratic Party hierarchy. What's the danger of that?
It's just that it's
not
Biden
enough.
tells me where there is no vision, the people perish. And Brother Biden, I voted for him, as you know, because it was an anti-fascist vote against the neo-fascist gangster Trump. But I know that Biden, he's got blood on his hands in terms of mass incarceration, in terms of invasion and occupation of Iraq, in terms of the unleashing of Wall Street greed, repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Wanting to cut Social Security, Medicare, bragging about working with segregationists, saying he would veto Medicare for all during a pandemic. Credible sexual assault allegation against him. It's a long, disgusting list.
So that all of those are recognitions of his past and the ways in which he is very much a creature of the past in terms of his vision. It's not a question of age. Bernie Sanders is about the same age.
Yep.
He's very much a creature of the future.
Much better politics, obviously.
About poor working people and what can be done in the radically democratic way. And so here, we're stuck with this nostalgic, mediocre president. He might be able to be pushed the way Lyndon B. Johnson was. We'll have to see. I want to give him a chance. But it doesn't look good.
I think the only way we're pushing Biden, like they saw Biden, we tried to push Biden left the other day, and he ended up breaking his foot in the shower or something. There's no pushing Biden left. Just look who he's appointing to his cabinet. Cabinet is policy, you know.
Let's really look at his cabinet.
Yep. Yeah.
So tied to Wall Street and tied to the Pentagon, war profiteering, the Secretary of State, Sister Janet. I love Sister Janet Yellen in many ways.
She sucks, dude.
What, $7 million?
Yep. Wall Street speeches.
Wall Street the last 3.5 years. Is she going to be fair to poor and working people?
Fuck
I want to
no.
give her a chance.
But
I'm
shit.
not holding my breath.
Yeah.
So we wonder whether the American democratic experiment is just running out of gas, whether it's headed toward a self-destruction because it's willful blindness by greed and its willful ignorance by contempt for poor and working people. Thinks that somehow he can muddle through. No, these chickens have now come home to roost in a very, very powerful way. In an ugly way.
In many ways, Trump did not create the phenomena. I remember Fritz Stern telling me once, the great scholar of fascism, that there was a yearning for fascism in Germany before the word fascism was invented. The disappearance of Trump doesn't really solve the problem. 74 million people voted for him despite 4 years of racist tropes, ineptitude, and utter failure to deal with the pandemic. We're talking about almost half the electorate.
That's true.
Where does that
58% of
half
white
go?
brothers, 53% of white sisters, more than 1 out of 3 of Asians, 1 out of 3 Jews, more than 1 out of 3 Latin, Latinos, 28% of our precious queers did. 18% of black men did. See, that's a collapse of an empire in which neoliberal rule has lost its legitimacy. They're looking for an alternative. Bernie Sanders gets crushed by the neoliberal
establishment,
Obama and Biden and Pelosi and others, and people's frustrations, their desperations, then get filtered in a neo-fascist way. In some ways, October 1922 is also worth taking a look at.
What is that?
And that march from Naples to Rome of Mussolini.
Mussolini.
What did he say?
Okay.
We need a myth. We need illusion. Forget about truth. Forget about facts. And this is the way you do it. A strong man can do it. Democracy might look good in theory. It is always a failure. It's only by means of a strong man mobilizing his own so forth and so on. And then, as you know, the capitulation of the king, and the next thing, in a matter of 10 days, he's now the ruler of Italy.
Mussolini.
And of course, the Churchill, the Thomas Edisons, and others are saying that even Freud himself calls him the great hero of culture. He was very popular in the 1820s in the West.
In many ways, the disappearance of Trump and the rise of a figure like Tom Cotton, maybe Mike Pompeo, or maybe someone we don't know, is more dangerous.
Yes.
More competent.
They would be competent as a fascist. Trump has no attention span, no organizational ability. If Biden continues to essentially do a reset of the Clinton-Obama years, what do you expect to see in the United States?
I expect to see a slide down a slippery slope to increased repression, increased social misery,
Increased depression.
increased not just polarization, but gangsterization. And that's a very sad prospect for the American empire and democratic possibility.
Yeah.
Now, can we turn it around? Well, some of us are committed to turning it around. But I come out of the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, and Edward Said, Grace Boggs, and these folk have an unstoppable fire for love of truth and a love of beauty and justice.
Love of truth, beauty, and
And
justice.
so we got to somehow come up with ways in which, following your example and others, we continue to try to be candid about the grimness, and yet still always looking for breakthroughs so that the dignity of everyday people, poor and working people, here and around the world, sits at the center of our vision.
Isn't it about reintegrating the working class? And we didn't speak about the black working class, which has suffered far worse than the white working class, but just, I would argue, the systems of social control, mass incarceration, militarized police are so draconian, especially in urban centers. They've been able to keep that class in check. But if we don't reintegrate those people back into the society, and that really calls for New Deal type programs, this divide is probably going to grow wider and wider. Would that be correct?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, for example, of the work that we've been able to do together in prison, so brother, your magnificent teachings there, it's what I would call a transformative integration into the system, which is to say, to gain access, opportunities, but access and opportunities that allow for a change and transformation in the system itself. So because what often happens is a neoliberal version of identity in which you get a colorful black, brown, red, yellow class hierarchy and imperial hierarchy all over again.
Yes.
We want
saw that with
black
Obama.
folk, brown folk, yellow folk, women, poor folk to move in a system in order to change it and transform the hierarchy itself here and abroad. And that's a larger project, but it's a vision that's worth holding on to. And holding on to with tremendous tenacity. And it means, of course, that many of us are going to be misunderstood, misconstrued, lied on, objects of character assassination or literal assassination, because this is part of what it is to be human. It's part of the history of the species. Most of the history of the species is one of domination and hatred and envy and contempt. And you have resistance and resilience in the face of those things. Of course, a Christian like myself, it's a matter of following Jesus into the temple to run out the money changers. And in the American Empire,
Jesus was a socialist.
The largest edifice east of Rome at that time, the troops and the banks. It means Wall Street, Pentagon, White House, Congress, Hollywood, Harvard, Princeton, all of those major institutions of the ruling class. There's some decent individuals in all of them, but the dominant tendencies of those institutions: greed, arrogance, condescension, indifference to the suffering of everyday people, of those the great Francois call
wretched of the earth.
And we're going to raise our voices.
Great.
We're going to raise our voices, and we're going to be part of movements.
Great, thank you. That was Dr. Cornel West about American Anatomy and Resistance.
Wow. Powerful, right? I hope you however much you watched, you got as much out of that as I did. Just a couple of things. Cornel West talked about the love of truth, beauty, and justice. I think he's perfect embodiment of that. How he's able to be very real and naming all of the huge, massive challenges that we face in the U.S. and globally, whether it be our domestic policy that how he points out has completely left the working class behind, especially these vulnerable and marginalized groups, the role of U.S. empire and how this insurrection, this coup attempt at the Capitol was chickens coming home to roost, and how even with all of these kind of grim realities that we're facing, we still need to be looking for these breakthroughs, finding ways that we can challenge and change these systems. He points whether it's Wall Street, Pentagon, Congress, the White House, Hollywood, these different educational institutions, how we just need to be ready and willing to raise our voices and seek out that love of truth, beauty, and justice. And I think both Hedges and Cornel West, Dr. Cornel West, are living examples of that we can really get a lot from their wisdom, from their knowledge, from their advocacy, from their writings, and just really treasure them and what they have to offer, and find our own ways to work within these systems to try to dismantle them, to build things up that are actually serving the everyday people, as Cornel West talks about. If you like the video, like the damn video, give it a thumbs up, share it, subscribe for more content. Peace, much love.